So I'm going to start with a bit of background on the phenomenon of loneliness and prevalence, particularly in adolescents. I'll talk a little bit about our vicious cycle theoretical model of the development of loneliness, and then some preliminary results from two studies. So, as you may know, loneliness has been defined as encompassing feelings of distress and dysphoria, resulting from a discrepancy between a person's desired and achieved levels of social relations. So there's that gap or dissatisfaction with social relationships that's important. And various countries have appointed ministers for loneliness, trying to understand its causes, its consequences, particularly its health consequences. In the United States, the former Surgeon General published an advisory in 2023 about our epidemic, so-called epidemic of loneliness and isolation, where the evidence on the health consequences are summarized. So here's a brief quote from this advisory that loneliness and isolation represent profound threats to our health and well-being. I'll talk a little bit about the health outcomes that loneliness has been associated with in just a minute. But I thought it was interesting that in this advisory, the Surgeon General highlighted some gaps in knowledge that actually align with what I would say are gaps in knowledge. So we don't really know the biological mechanisms through which loneliness has an impact on our physical health and mental health. And we also don't fully understand how it develops and how it emerges. It's the trends in loneliness are very concerning. According to a 2019 study, 61% of Americans report feeling lonely at least sometimes. And younger groups are more affected by it. As you can see here, Gen Z is more affected than older populations. So you can see here about 79% report being lonely at least sometimes, although the percentages are smaller when we look at those who often experience loneliness. This is still pretty concerning. And as I mentioned in the Surgeon General's advisory, it was discussed that chronic loneliness is a risk factor for a number of conditions, including depression, social anxiety, suicide, as well as heart disease, hypertension, and premature mortality. In adolescence, loneliness is linked to depression, suicidality, social anxiety, as well as substance use, alcohol and tobacco. So it's a problem for health. One of the interesting questions I became fascinated by is why loneliness spikes during adolescence. So children do experience loneliness, according to some reports, fewer than 20%. But in adolescence, we see a spike with more than 50% experiencing recurring feelings of loneliness, although the percentage is smaller when we look at those who experience chronic loneliness, so often experiencing loneliness. And there are developmental reasons for why this might be. Adolescents may be at risk of developing loneliness due to neurobiological and social transitions that occur during this developmental period. They're also more susceptible to social evaluation and social anxiety compared to children. There's a dramatic increase in the prevalence of social anxiety during this period, but it's unclear whether loneliness causes social anxiety or social anxiety causes loneliness. They seem to co-develop during this period. So with my student Sally and Geneva, we proposed a vicious cycle model of chronic loneliness. I know it's a bit overwhelming, but we're going to look at various components of this model later on. So we're thinking that relationship quality with parents, siblings, and peers, higher relationship quality is protective against loneliness. Personality factors like introversion, disagreeableness, neuroticism, which is a tendency towards negative emotionality, and shyness increase risk of loneliness, whereas stress reactivity increases risk of loneliness. That gives us a kind of starting point for loneliness at the beginning of adolescence. And then during adolescence, there is a vicious cycle that gets started, where loneliness can amplify stress reactivity. Stress reactivity can trigger stress behaviors like increased fight or flight behaviors, maybe reduced tend and befriend behaviors in some youth. This could lead to problems in relationships, social withdrawal, reduced social skill development, which then further increases loneliness. So this could get youth trapped in a kind of vicious cycle over time of increasing loneliness and stress, and social impacts. So we thought, let's find some data sets and let's collect some data to test these models. And we focused on 4 biological systems. For the stress reactivity piece, we wanted to look at how oxytocin, cortisol, autonomic physiology, and inflammation markers change from pre to post stress. Let's see if I can advance the slides. We're going to look at 2 different studies to try to test some of these components of this model. So first, I was fortunate to have access to data from the California Families Project, which is a study of 674 Mexican origin youth who were recruited at age 10 and have been followed for almost 20 years now, but I'll present data from ages 10 to 23. And we had data on time spent alone across adolescence, school transitions, and many, many measures of relationship quality with parents and peers, as well as personality. And we had loneliness measured at age 23. And then I'll tell you about a second study that we've been collecting data for in my lab, which is the Social Disconnection Project, where we had adolescents ages 11 to 15 come to the lab, do a lab stressor, the Trier Social Stress Test for children. We assessed stress responses of the autonomic nervous system, cortisol, oxytocin, and inflammatory markers using blood samples. And we assessed loneliness at 2 time points, at time 1 and 1 year follow-up. So these are the 2 studies, and I'm going to show you the different components of the models that we're going to test. So first, we're going to look at relationship quality and personality as they predict loneliness, sort of the left-hand side of the model with California Families Project data. This is a study that's been led for 20 years by Rick Robbins and my students Geneva, Sally, and collaborators, statisticians Micah Rimtula and Anna Waisoki helped with the structural equation modeling. So we had 3 research questions here. One, what is the average trajectory of time spent alone across adolescence, and how does this trajectory change after the transition to high school? Then we wanted to see if parent-child and peer relationships, as well as youth personality, predict increased versus decreased proportion of time spent alone, and whether time spent alone in adolescence is associated with loneliness at age 23. 674 Mexican origin youth from this California Families Project, a longitudinal design, reporting on data from age 10 to 23 here, 12 waves of assessment of family, school, community, individual characteristics. Youth reported on a recreation scale how much time they spent of their recreation time alone versus with friends, family, other activities in 7th grade through 12th grade. And we had measures of what schools they attended at each of these waves, so we could see when they had a school transition, a school change. For most of them, it was from 8th grade to 9th grade, but it was when it was different, we captured the actual transition for different youth. We focused on 9th grade measures. That's when we had the most of our constructs measured. We had parent reported and child reported support, conflict. We also had behavioral coding of videotaped interactions in 9th grade, which were coded for parental warmth, and parental hostility. We had peer relationship quality composed of 4 relevant scales that we reduced through factor analysis. And we had measures of personality, both parent and child reports of the child's personality using the Big 5 inventory and the early adolescent temperament questionnaire here in 9th grade. So we're going to use relationships and personality to predict time spent alone, as well as age 23 loneliness, which was measured with the loneliness short form from the UCLA loneliness scale and 1 item from the CSD scale. So for the first research question, what's just the average trajectory of time spent alone across adolescence, and how does this trajectory change after the transition to high school? We hypothesized that there would be different possibilities for this trajectory of time spent alone. So we would look at a linear change model versus an exponential change model versus a no change model and see what fits the data best. The linear growth model was the best fitting model for our data, so we retained this for our analyses. And we also set up our structural equations models to have ninth grade as our intercept, and then to have an overall linear slope for the rest of the TSA, or time spent alone, time points from 7th grade to 12th grade. So we're going to have a ninth grade intercept and a slope in time spent alone from 7th grade to 12th grade across all these models. We again found an average linear increase in time spent alone from 7th grade to 12th grade. You can see it plotted here. On average, they spent about 14.5% of their total reported time was spent alone in 9th grade. And there was about a 1.4 increase in time spent alone across waves as the rate of change or slope. And we found that youth who spend more time alone in 9th grade also had a steeper increase and their slope in the proportion of time spent alone from 7th to 12th grade, kind of supporting this model that if you are elevated on the intercept, you're going to be increasing across this way, perhaps suggesting a vicious cycle happening. But there were a tremendous amount of individual differences. Each of these rectangles is a unique participant. So you can see here that there are some who have low levels of time spent alone, some who are increasing at one wave, some who have elevated levels of multiple waves. So our analyses indicated that the individual level variation in changes in proportion of time spent alone was quite significant. And so this led us to ask what may be driving these individual differences in the proportion of time spent alone. You can see here various patterns. We hypothesized there would be an effect of the school transition when youth change schools. We relied on this Caspian-Moffitt personality accentuation hypothesis that our personality tendencies are maybe accentuated during times of environmental change. So maybe youth who are more introverted become even more introverted and lonely during these school transitions. However, we did not find any support for this accentuation hypothesis. To assess the impact of the school transition on time spent alone, we regressed the school transition at each wave on time spent alone at the same wave, and we found that there are small, non-significant effects of the school transition. So this hypothesized effect for school transitions were not supported. It did not seem to make much of a difference in their time spent alone trajectories. So that was our first research question, just kind of describing the patterns of time spent alone and whether it may change with school transitions. For our second question, we looked at parent-child and peer relationships, as well as youth personality, to see how it predicts increase versus decrease proportion of time spent alone. So here we ran 3 separate models. One, we looked at parent-child measures shown in orange. So that was one model as they predict time spent alone. Then we looked at peer relationship quality in a separate model shown in green. And then finally, in purple, we had the personality models where we looked at introversion, neuroticism, and agreeableness predicting time spent alone. And then we looked at shyness separately because it overlaps with introversion and neuroticism. And so we wanted to look at that on its own. So we found, as predicted for our first relationship models, that parental warmth negatively predicted the proportion of time spent alone. So youth with more parental warmth spent less time alone in 9th grade, but there was no prediction to the overall slope. And parental hostility predicted more time alone at the intercept level, but there was no prediction to the slope. This will be a theme. We couldn't find any predictors of the slope, but we could predict that intercept quite well. When we looked at peer relationships, peer relationship quality, which is a composite of many different measures, higher peer relationship quality predicted less time spent alone in 9th grade, but did not predict the overall slope. And when we looked at the 5-factor model, the 3 personality traits we focused on, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, entered in the model at the same time. We found that neuroticism, or the tendency towards negative emotionality like anxiety and depression, significantly predicted the proportion of perceived time spent alone in 9th grade, but did not predict the overall slope. And in this data set of Mexican origin youth, we don't find significant associations or strong associations with extroversion or agreeableness. It seems to be that neuroticism plays a really important role here. When we looked at shyness separately, we did not find a link between shyness and either the 9th grade intercept or the slope, which is really interesting because other studies had found links between shyness and loneliness. So we don't find those links here among Mexican origin youth. So that was our analyses with relationships and personality. We wanted to see whether time spent alone, solitude as a behavioral marker would predict loneliness at age 23. And we were basing this on literature that social withdrawal and middle childhood and early adolescence may be linked to peer exclusion and depressive symptoms. And even though solitude can be productive and enjoyable and important for adolescents as they develop their identities, it's also when it exceeds sort of average or typical levels, it's predictive of peer difficulties and anxiety and depression and peer-related loneliness. So we thought that if youth spent more time alone in adolescence, they would be lonelier at age 23, and this was our pre-registered hypothesis. And by the way, all of our hypotheses were pre-registered. So we indeed found that youth who spent more time alone in 9th grade had significantly elevated levels of loneliness at age 23, as predicted. So key takeaways from this is that there's a significant increase in the proportion of perceived time alone across adolescents. There are individual differences, however, in the proportion of solitary time, and school transition was not as disruptive as expected. We did not find any evidence that school transitions amplified or changed time spent alone. We also found that, as predicted, relationship quality and personality traits may impact the amount of time spent alone in 9th grade, with neuroticism being particularly predictive. But we couldn't find any predictors of the slope or the changes in the proportion of solitary time across adolescence. And then finally, we found that the proportion of time spent alone in adolescence predicts young adult loneliness at age 23. And we could not predict links between the slope in time spent alone and loneliness at age 23. So the slope didn't really do much for us in this study. Okay, so we tested some interesting pieces of our model with respect to relationships and personality. Next, I want to show you a little bit more of some of the work that my students have been doing from a new data collection effort, the Social Disconnection Project, where we're trying to recruit 300 adolescents ages 11 to 15, assess stress responses, assess loneliness at 2 time points. They're doing the lab stressor, the true social stress test for biomarker assessment. We have 11 more adolescents to test before we get to 300, and we haven't fully assayed all the biomarkers, so I'm going to show you some preliminary data today, but I think it's interesting. And I do want to thank all my lab managers, Sydney, Christine, Kelsey, Scarlett, and Bella, for this work, as well as graduate students, Rose, Rebecca, Joanna, who hails from UCSF, Geneva, Sally, and Anna. They did all of this work. In the study, we're trying to see if stress and loneliness during adolescence, a period of time when we have there's an increase in stress reactivity and emotional reactivity. We know from previous work in adult humans and primates that loneliness is linked to heightened cortisol production. We also know that cumulative stress may lead to heightened cortisol production, but also sometimes a blunted cortisol response after a laboratory social stress test. And we also know that dysregulation of cortisol production can lead to adverse health outcomes. This was a question that was interesting to my student, Rose McLaughlin, who was interested in youth who belong to racial ethnic minority groups, who may experience the compounded effects of both minority stress and loneliness. So she's going to examine that in these analyses. Here's Rose. She was interested in stress, loneliness, and racial ethnic representation in schools, so the extent to which adolescents are demographically represented in their schools. We know from a lot of developmental research that adolescent friendships follow the principle of homophily, so the tendency to affiliate and bond with others who are similar, sort of birds of a feather flock together. And we know that there's a study in Denmark finding that adolescents who did not belong to the majority racial ethnic group may have higher rates of loneliness. And in the US, one study found that African American and Latino students felt lonelier in less ethnically diverse classrooms. However, this was all the research that we found in adolescents on this issue, so we thought it'd be worth investigating and replicating these findings further. We hypothesized, we had let's see, 5 pre-registered hypotheses here. One was that adolescents who identify with a racial ethnic group that is underrepresented in their school will report higher levels of loneliness, controlling for age and sex. Then we also predicted that adolescents who identify with a racial ethnic group that's underrepresented will have higher levels of loneliness after controlling for age, sex, and personality. We hypothesized that adolescents who are underrepresented again will have higher levels of hair cortisol and a blunted salivary cortisol response to a lab stressor. And adolescents who are lonely will show elevated levels of hair cortisol and a blunted salivary cortisol response to a lab stressor. And finally, that personality traits, extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, and shyness will be associated with loneliness, similar to the first study that I just described. So I have preliminary data from 246 adolescents analyzed here. They were ages 11 to 15, about 13 years old on average, about roughly half male, half female. This is their breakdown based on race, ethnicity. You see, we had as pretty representative of California, Asian, African American, Hispanic, multiracial, and white non-Hispanic youth shown here with different colors. We used an adolescent version of the UCLA loneliness scale, the Roberts version, the Rules 8 to measure loneliness, the Big 5 inventory, which has been used as young as age 10, and the revised early adolescent temperament questionnaire, again, to measure shyness, which is appropriate for ages 9 to 15. We looked at cortisol. We had a hair sample capturing a 3-month cortisol output and saliva samples. And I'll also touch a little bit on some of the other biomarkers. We had oxytocin measured in saliva samples and 2 blood samples looking at inflammatory markers. Those are very preliminary, so I didn't put them on the slide. In terms of racial ethnic representation, Rose had the idea to look at the school demographics of each school that participants attended and extract the percentage of students with the same racial ethnic identity as the participant. Higher percentages indicate more racial ethnic representation, so having more peers with the same racial ethnic identity. And she extracted the school demographic data from EdData, which is publicly available. And for multiracial adolescents, they could endorse a primary identity, or we could use both or multiple of their identities to look at percentages. So this is what the data look like on EdData. If you pull up a specific, let's say, school like Holmes Junior High, they have the percent of students who belong to each of these groups for different years, and we would extract the demographics for the year when the participant attended a lab visit. So if they came to our lab in 2022, we would pull those statistics to see how many students in their school had the same demographic characteristics as the participant. So we found a range of racial ethnic representation in our sample. You can see here that some students had nobody in their school of the same racial ethnic background. Some had half the school, and some had 100% of the school had the same identity, which has allowed us to look at this research question. So first, for our first hypotheses, hypotheses 1 and 2, we looked at racial ethnic representation and whether it was related to loneliness. So here we find that in a linear regression model that predicts loneliness, racial ethnic representation, so having more representation, a higher percentage of students with the same racial ethnic background in their school was associated with lower levels of loneliness. And this remained true. And there was also a sex effect with girls having higher levels of loneliness. And the racial ethnic representation effect remains significant once we control for age, sex, as well as all the personality traits, shyness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And we found significant effects for extroversion and neuroticism with more introverted youth and youth with more neuroticism, more negative emotionality, having greater levels of loneliness. This is what it looks like. More racial ethnic representation in your school means less loneliness for that negative association there. It's subtle, but it's there and significant. For our third hypothesis, we looked at racial ethnic representation and cortisol, and there was no association there. It's as close to zero as you would get. So being underrepresented was not related to hair cortisol or salivary cortisol, baseline or reactivity. When we looked at hair cortisol, there was no association. When we look at cortisol and loneliness, maybe we'll see something there. We had a lot of hypotheses around that. There was no association between hair cortisol and loneliness, very close to zero there for the beta coefficient, and no association between salivary cortisol and loneliness either, which is surprising to me. This is very preliminary, but I wanted to give you a sense of whether we're finding links with other stress biomarkers. This is very, very preliminary. This is a partial subsample, but we do find links with autonomic nervous system physiology. So loneliness was associated with lower levels of parasympathetic nervous system. So we had respiratory sinus arrhythmia at rest. We're also processing data for RSA during the trio social stress test. There's a promising trend towards a negative association between loneliness and average levels of salivary oxytocin. The p-value is small there, 0.12, but it is looking like it's pretty consistent, not driven by outliers or anything like that. We've only run 40 participants so far on the oxytocin assay, so we still need to do a lot more assays with that. There's no association between loneliness and elevations in inflammatory markers, CRP, IL-6, IL-10, or IL-8 so far in partial analyses of about 118 participants. And there's actually trend level associations with a lower TNF-alpha and lower SUPAR. So we're not just not finding elevated inflammation, we're finding lower TNF-alpha and SUPAR if those trends hold and become significant in the full sample. So I'm kind of rethinking how loneliness may relate to biomarkers here. I'm starting to think of autonomic activity and oxytocin as reflecting perhaps a concurrent biological embodiment of loneliness, whereas perhaps associations with cortisol and inflammation emerge later in adulthood as the physiological toll of loneliness over many years, if it accumulates over time, in a kind of allostatic load model, which would explain why we're not finding this with adolescents, but this has been found in the adult literature, especially in middle-aged and older adults, where they do find links of loneliness with cortisol inflammation, as well as other indices of allostatic load. Very preliminary, but just sort of interesting to put that out there. Stay tuned for the full sample results. And finally, our fifth hypothesis was about personality and loneliness. And again, we find the expected results there with introversion predicting more loneliness and neuroticism predicting more loneliness, with very strong coefficients for neuroticism and very consistent between study 1 and study 2. Neuroticism seems to come out as a strong predictor. And as a small aside, we're doing a collaborative study with some international collaborators from Chile and China, where we're looking at personality correlates of loneliness. And so far, the Chile sample and the US samples of young adults show similar patterns as this as well. So this seems to be replicating across countries, across ages. Here's the visualization. for that link between loneliness and extroversion. So the more introverted someone is or lower extroversion scores they have, the higher their loneliness levels. And here's the link with neuroticism, where higher levels of neuroticism, of negative emotionality, predicts higher levels of loneliness in this sample of 11 to 15-year-olds. So what we find here in this study, just to wrap this up, racial ethnic underrepresentation could be another important predictor of loneliness that we should perhaps consider, in addition to personality and the quality of social relationships. We find that we suspect that adolescents who are racially or ethnically underrepresented in their school may be able to find fewer peers with the same cultural background, which may lead to feelings of loneliness. And it's possible that the demographic composition of schools may influence both racial ethnic identity development, as well as exposure to discrimination, potentially raising the risk for loneliness. Personality remains a leading predictor of loneliness in our data as well. This is consistent with prior meta-analytic evidence, which primarily was based on adult studies. There's very little work in developmental samples in that meta-analysis. So it turns out that the same kind of predictors hold in adolescence as in adulthood. We don't find links with cortisol output, and I don't suspect those will change in the full sample, since we had about 246 adolescents assayed and the coefficients are pretty close to zero. But we'll have to wait for the full sample. Perhaps other sources of stress have a larger impact on cortisol output than stress from underrepresentation and loneliness. Again, as a caveat, this is preliminary and we need to reanalyze with a full sample of 300 when we get it in the spring. I want to give you one more bit of data before we do Q&A. This is a sub-project that my graduate student Rebecca Twine launched. She had an interest in adverse childhood experiences as a risk factor for loneliness. This wasn't in our model, but of course, probably should have been. I want to show you these really interesting results and analyses that she conducted. So we had a fair amount of ACEs in our sample. You can see here 46.7% of adolescents experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, including things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, experiencing parental divorce, witnessing domestic violence, or living with a parent who has psychopathology or substance abuse. So 53.3% didn't have any of these ACEs. We measured this with a BRFSS ACE module, but you can see that a fair amount of youth had 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 or 6 ACEs. There's one per person has 6 ACEs here. You can see here the frequency count that Rebecca put together, and I also have the prevalence rate for each of the different specific ACEs in our sample. You can see here 29.1% had emotional abuse. We had separation or divorce, some physical abuse, some domestic violence, and so on. I won't read all the percentages. We did file CPS reports for instances of abuse. And so we can look now at whether ACEs are risk factors for loneliness, and Rebecca found indeed that ACEs significantly predicted higher levels of loneliness in adolescents, with a very strong beta coefficient there, and the association remained significant after we adjust for age, sex, and personality traits. So ACEs predict about 14% of variance in loneliness here when we look at the overall pattern and the scatter plot and the R-squared on that association. All right, so I'm going to give you a quick summary and then we can chat and have Q&A, which I look forward to. We found in study 1 that in the California Families Project that time spent alone increases across adolescence, seemingly linear, in a linear fashion. That time spent alone in adolescence predicts loneliness in young adulthood and is associated with poor social relationships with parents and peers, as well as high levels of neuroticism or negative emotions. We need to understand this co-development of loneliness and negative emotionality a bit more, kind of moving beyond these very strong correlations of loneliness with depressed affect, anxious affect, as well as with emotion volatility, which are the three subscales of neuroticism. We found that both exogenous factors, like being underrepresented in one school from a racial, ethnic, demographic perspective, and endogenous factors like personality are associated with loneliness, with stronger effects for neuroticism than introversion. We found that cortisol measures are not associated with loneliness so far in adolescence. Maybe other stress physiology markers might be better correlates, maybe autonomic. We're finding links with autonomic physiology in the data we've processed so far, and the oxytocin results look promising as well. We'll likely need to revise our vicious cycle model to exclude stress reactivity or really rethink what role the HPA axis is playing here in the development of loneliness. When we started this out, I really thought that the increase in cortisol that happens with puberty is going to play a role. But there's no association between cortisol and loneliness, or at least in the measures that we've assayed so far. So I think the model is going to need some revision. We do find that adverse childhood experiences explain about 14% of variance in loneliness in adolescents, suggesting possible avenues for prevention and intervention. And this finding is also leading me to start thinking about next steps, what we want to do for our next study of loneliness in adolescents. I'm starting to think that social learning mechanisms, perhaps leading to cognitive biases about social interactions and social relationships, might play a role. So I want to measure things like hostile attribution bias and cognitive biases like expecting rejection in ambiguous situations when there's no direct evidence that there's a need to do so. That may tie these early adverse childhood experiences to later risk of loneliness. It may amplify loneliness over time. It may also explain why we find such high levels of negative emotions among adolescents who experience loneliness, if they've developed sort of these negative cognitive biases about others, about social relationships, about themselves in relationships. And this is also making me think that the initial model that I had was missing a critical piece on environmental affordances. I'm calling them affordances. These are constraints or opportunities afforded by the environment, what we can access in terms of social relationships in our environment, and what is that quality of relationship that exists. That is likely a critical factor. And here we're thinking about affordances not just in the immediate family, but also schools and digital media. So we really want to branch out next into exploring the role of digital media in loneliness. When I talk to our adolescent a community advisory board, this is where they want us to go next. And I have some pilot data showing that is indeed an important factor to look at. So we're going to look at those digital media affordances as well. So as I've alluded to, I think our model is in theoretical model that we started out with is in need of revision. And this is what I'm kind of working with right now. We're expanding beyond just personality and relationship quality to think a little bit more about affordances and social learning and emotions, especially negative emotions. In this PARSE model, I love acronyms. So personality, affordances, relationship quality, social learning and emotions model to try to predict loneliness. And then on the right-hand side, I'm changing really how I think about the biological systems involved in loneliness. I'm thinking that maybe links with inflammation and oxytocin emerge over long periods of time later on. Same with other markers of allostatic load. And that in young people, we would mostly just find links with autonomic physiology and oxytocin, which are perhaps shaping the vigilance they feel in the moment, the social anxiety. Both of these have been linked to both to oxytocin and to sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activity. So I think those systems are going to be more relevant for adolescents. And I'm trying to focus more on the cognitive processes as well that may be involved here, which was an aspect of loneliness that we didn't really have in the first model that I looked at, that I showed you. This is still probably very too simple compared to sort of what the reality is, but this is what we're working with right now. Um, and I'd like to thank NIH, specifically NICHD, and their support in funding this work, my social environment and stress lab, and the students and lab managers who helped collect the data. And here they are. They are lovely, and I'm fortunate to work with them every single day. They help. They are my stress buffers. So thank you so much. Thanks so much to you for your attention. And I really look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful talk, Dr. Hosner, and also
Thank you.
um, so timely. I know that a lot of us are thinking more and more about loneliness, and it's so helpful to think about it starting a little earlier in folks' trajectories. Um, and it looks like we already have a couple questions, and so let's go to the audience. Elisa, I think I saw your hand up first.
Yeah, that was just wonderful. Thank you. Such good work with adolescents. My question is about depression, and since we know it's closely associated with loneliness and some of the other outcomes you were measuring, do you account for depression at all? I mean, what if depression is kind of driving some of the relationships you're looking at? I mean, does it make sense to parse out the depression piece and just look at loneliness? I mean, can it stand alone?
Yes, this is a very complex question. Thank you so much for that. We we use measures of depression that don't have loneliness items. Some scales actually assess depression by asking one of the items is to ask people if they're lonely. So that's how tightly linked they are. Um, I think we can control for depression and see it as a separate issue. I think the overarching question is sort of what is the relationship between negative affect and loneliness? Is negative affect or depression? Is it a precursor? Is it a correlate of depression? Is it a consequence? I'm sorry, is it a consequence of loneliness, a correlate of loneliness, a precursor? There are some longitudinal studies out there from Europe, from Luke Goosen's work, where they've tried to look at depression, anxiety, and loneliness using cross-lab panel models over several waves to see if one predicts the other or if there's temporal associations there. Um, there seem to be bidirectional associations, and you always find the cross-sectional associations between depression, anxiety, and loneliness. I think we need the cross-lag panel models have been criticized that they don't pull apart between person differences versus within person differences. So one thing I'd like to do next is really do maybe ecological monetary assessments to really see what the right time scale for these associations is. Is it that these three states, loneliness, anxiety, and depression, are always co-occurring at any point? Is it that I hypothesize that social anxiety is perhaps preceding loneliness, that we have anxiety in childhood or in early adolescence, that's leading to social withdrawal, is leading to loneliness, and then depression follows later on if you measure it on the right time scale. But it could be that these all co-occur. Of course, negative affect is part of the definition of loneliness. It's dissatisfaction with your relationships. And so, to a certain extent, uh, these may not even be possible to pull them apart. Um, I think loneliness is a pathway to depression, but there are other pathways to depression. So, it's possible to find depressed adolescents without loneliness. I don't know if it's possible to find lonely adolescents without depression, or at least subclinical symptoms of depression. Um, I think that's sort of where I'm at with that. I want to unpack sort of why these are associated a little bit more. So looking at cognitive biases, and also trying to get peer reports of the adolescent relationship quality. So I want to do a study looking at in the lab social interaction between two adolescents where they rate each other's, they rate the interaction because I want to see if adolescents who are lonely perceive that interaction to be more negative than it really was according to their social partner. To see sort of whether depressed affect is acting as a filter, um, that's coloring that whole interaction, or is it more of a consequence of being lonely that comes afterwards as you recognize and take stock of your relationships? The short answer is I don't know. Um, but I have some ideas for how we could probe this relationship a little bit more to really understand, because I think if you can understand this, I think you could reduce both loneliness and depression prevalence in adolescents. Philippe.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. Several thoughts, things that probably you've already thought about, but time spent alone, we don't really know what they're doing while they're alone. That's one thing. As a reviewer, I would ask that. Then separately, did you collect any, or will you collect any sleep data, sleep quality data? That would be very important, I think, especially via something we often don't even think about in young people or like adolescents. And then thirdly, I was thinking if you have any data on engagement in, for example, youth sports, team sports in particular, not solo sports, but team sports and youth musical theater. These are things that I just from my own two daughters, I see the kids who are involved in team sports, in group musical theater, for example, they really have that might be a buffer to loneliness and all of the negative consequences. And yeah, those are just some thoughts.
Great questions. For the first one, I don't know what they're doing. They're alone. We didn't
Right.
ask. For your third question about extracurriculars, I believe we have information on that, so we could look at that. Sports, team sports, and so on. I don't have measures of sleep, unfortunately. I know we have wonderful sleep experts here, Eric and others. I tend to believe that you should either measure sleep really well or not measure it at all. So I don't have measures of sleep here, but I do think it might play a role in that um, rumination cycle that maybe gets established that links depression and loneliness together. So I think it's probably an important factor. We just need to look at that better. I think the ABCD study has data on
It does.
loneliness and they have sleep data. And we've just accessed it with my collaborator, Dr. Amanda Geyer, and we've looked at profiles of social health and loneliness. Um, and that would be a wonderful idea for us to pursue, to maybe try and pull those sleep data and see if we could tie that to loneliness across the adolescent period. Thank you, Philippe. That's a great suggestion.
I'd also love to sneak in with a question. Um, I'm really curious about the development of these processes and how it relates to health and mental health earlier in development. And I know we really think about adolescence as that critical, like peer network development time, but obviously those origins start when kids are younger and transitioning into school and learning how to develop friends. I'm curious if you've thought about this model and these associations and how important they are, in the kind of early childhood 4 to 6 range.
That's a wonderful question. I always try to go back in development as early as I can. I was discussing this with Kristen Bernard and Mary Dozier, who do early life sort of attachment interventions with the ABC intervention. I was pouring through their papers to see if they've ever measured loneliness, and they have not. So I was trying to ask them if they could add it in or they could look at that, because I do think it'd be really powerful if we could show that these early attachment interventions or parent-child interventions then later impact loneliness risk. I do think that what we're ultimately wanting to do is to really think about all these different risk factors for loneliness and identify corresponding interventions for each of them. And so for the parent-child relationship risk factor, we would have attachment interventions. For social anxiety, you know, we have great interventions for that in children. For personality, it's malleable actually, that you can shift various personality traits, especially neuroticisms, in therapy and so on. So I am starting to think along these lines that you're hinting at of, okay, how can we intervene and how can we intervene early once we
Mhm.
know what the risk factors are? And I do think that, you know, if I could convince early childhood researchers to add sort of measures of loneliness in adolescence or adulthood, I think we will find those links there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm also just as I'm asking, how would we even measure that in little kids? I'm not sure if self-report would work super well
Mm.
with a 4-year-old. And I do worry like caregivers might be biased. Do you have any thoughts on how you would look at this in younger kids? I'm
Um,
just selfishly thinking this through myself. Like, how would you do this?
it's a good question. So, I mean, Christian Lagatuda's work shows that kids could report on feeling good or bad as young as 3 or 4.
Okay, we can do 3.
Maybe even younger. So I think you wouldn't be able to ask them if they feel lonely, but I think that you could ask them if they feel good or bad after spending time with friends or after school.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of school avoidance, or I think behavioral indicators might be better in young children where you see avoidance of social interactions. There are sociometric measures where they show children. So you could go into a preschool and assess each child individually and show them pictures of all their classmates and ask them
Mm.
who spends a lot of time by themselves, and they could point and they could tell you who.
Oh, like a peer nomination,
A
but
peer
like,
nomination kind of
yeah,
procedure.
interesting.
Yeah, where they could tell you which children are socially isolated. Even in I would say kindergarten, you could definitely do it.
Yeah.
Probably preschool. So I think that would be interesting. Um, Going back to Philippe's point about how social activities could be buffering, we also see that there are some children and adolescents who feel alone or lonely even in the presence of others.
Mm-hmm.
It's a
Mm.
small percentage, but there are I think some vulnerable youth who may show this very early pattern of isolation and withdrawal, perhaps as a result of victimization. This tends to be in young children as a result of victimization or bullying. Um, Peer victimization is a very strong correlate of social withdrawal in young children. So I think that that's going to be something important there to look
Thank
at.
you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Just one more thought is wondering and measuring two things. Is there an older sister? Does the participant in your study have an older sister?
That's
And
such a
that
good
links,
idea. We have measures of we did the life stress interview.
yeah,
So we do ask, who do you live at home with? That's one of the part of
yeah.
the LSI.
And,
So we have that. We have everyone they live
and
with.
but I want to justify the why that would be interesting is because female emotional verbal fluency. So I would suggest that if it's a female in general, like measuring emotional verbal fluency, and especially if the participant has an older sister who models greater verbal fluency in general, but especially use greater amount of emotional words and emotional granularity. That I mean, I'm just seeing again, my cohort. Uh, that's could be a very interesting factor for development of emotional
As
awareness,
a big
emotional
sister,
granularity.
I completely agree with you. I think my brother greatly benefited from
Yes.
having me.
And the benefit might be greater in boys, participants who are boys, than girls.
Yes,
But
and
that's
there's
a
actually a
hypothesis.
paper in Psychological Science a few years ago
Yeah,
showing greater vocabulary development among children who have an older sister. It wasn't
exactly.
specifically focused on emotional granularity or
But
fluent.
verbal fluency. Yeah,
But it was showing a vocabulary advantage or language acquisition advantage in children who have an older sister. So I do think, the Name It to Tame It from Alyssa's book. Uh, I read the stress prescription book, and I loved it. But I think, yeah, I think language and the extent to which children can name emotions is very important for young children as well. Eric says, explain so much for me. I knew something was missing. You don't have a big sister. That's a critical thing.
And I think I do know, I'm just noting the time, Dr. Hosner, and also this is a really strong point to end on because I can tell my younger sister about how helpful I was for her development when I see her in a few days. Thank
Yes.
you so much, Dr. Hosner. This has been a really interesting topic and a great conversation. We really appreciate your time. I know everyone's jumping off, but I do want to remind you next month, January 20th, we will welcome epidemiologist Andres Cardenas, who's an expert in exposures and epigenetic age acceleration. And I know a lot of us like that kind of thing. So thank you again, Dr. Hosner. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the week and takes good care.
Thank you so much and happy holidays.
Yeah, happy holidays. Thanks,
Thank you.
guys.
Thank you.